Hi and welcome to episode 26 of Beating BDD, a podcast about body dysmorphic disorder from the BDD Foundation. Our guest for this episode is Eva Fisher, who's been recovered from the disorder for an impressive 20 years. This episode is a little different from usual in that Eva tells us her story directly, without questions or annoying interruptions from me. It's a story in 4 parts. In the first, which you'll hear in a second, Eva describes how her life is now compared with when she had BDD and what motivates her to put her story out there. Hope you enjoyed the episode.
I would say probably the biggest difference is really being able to enjoy and find some peace with my body and just being able to look outside myself and enjoy other people and moving ahead in my life with my PhD and now my book. I'm turning my PhD dissertation into a book called The BDD Family, Coping with Body Dysmorphic Disorder in a Peer Support Group. So it's felt really good in terms of being able to move forward, but the BDD is obviously still a part of my life. I'm currently facilitating 2 support groups, virtual support groups, both of which are actually available. Information on them is available both on the BDD Foundation website as well as the International OCD Foundation website. And they're very well attended. The recovery from BDD, especially so, which meets 2 Thursdays every month. I really like to let people know that recovery from BDD is possible. But I also realize that a lot of people are still struggling with this disorder every day. That is the point of putting my story out there, is really to provide hope that recovery is possible, to encourage people to keep fighting and to really find coping mechanisms, but even more importantly, to get treatment for this disorder, because treatment is available. And I really urge people, and I'll be glad to talk about kind of a little bit about the treatment I received and then how I moved on from having BDD.
In this second section, Eva talks us through her lived experience with BDD, including when it developed, her decision to have a rhinoplasty, and how she realised she was suffering from a mental health condition.
Well, what's interesting is that tomorrow is my birthday. And it's interesting because it also marks 40 years since I first started experiencing BDD symptoms. I first started experiencing them when I was 16. Before that, and even now, in terms of coping, while I had BDD and even now, I'm in Colorado, close to the Rocky Mountains, great hiking out here. It's just beautiful. And definitely getting outdoors was always kind of my thing. I was very shy as a child, very introverted. So I didn't have a lot of friends that I played with. My mom was pretty much my best friend for a long time. And so I just liked spending time out in the woods, like around the house, taking walks by myself. And I really just enjoyed being outdoors. And then kind of when I turned 16, I just knew that I was spending a lot more time in the mirror. And I dressed up for high school. I made sure I looked really good. I always put on makeup and, high heels or jeans, very tight jeans were in at that time. And, I just remember spending a lot of time in the mirror and just becoming really obsessed with looking in the mirror and making sure that my hair looked great and my makeup looked great and all this stuff. But the more I looked, the more I realized that, I didn't really like my features very much. I just remember just spending more and more time kind of just in front of the mirror and, less time outdoors. And there were a lot of things going on with my family at that point. I mean, my parents had gotten divorced and I was just always very sensitive and I was being bullied a lot in high school. So, there were a lot of kind of things that were happening, but I just remember, when I was 18, I knew I was going off to college because my parents were both artists, but they had both gotten bachelor's degrees, and they made it clear to my brother and I that, academics was something that, we should excel at. And we did for the most part. But, it was just clear, so I knew I was going to go off to college in the fall. And I think it was, probably in the spring to summer when this obsession with my nose started getting really bad. And I also feel like I had BDD by proxy, which is when you're worried about someone else's features, like you're obsessed with someone else's features. And I wasn't so much obsessed with someone else's features as much as I knew that I didn't want to have kids because I didn't want them to end up with my ugly nose. And I was feeling really awful. Like the worst thing I could imagine is having kids with my ugly nose. And I told my mom that. I said, I just feel like I wasn't going to commit suicide, but I almost felt suicidal just at the thought of anyone else suffering with this really ugly nose that I had. And, I had been getting some counseling for the bullying because I was very upset about the bullying, but I don't know. I mean, I think part of it is my mom may have agreed with me because I know the self-portrait that I have when I was 13 that she did. My mom being an artist, of course, she did portraits of my brother and I in still lives and things like that. And she actually altered my nose in the painting. I can see it now, but she changed it. She changed my nose in this painting. And so I don't know if when I'm saying, I'm considering suicide because my nose, it's ugly, it's fat. I don't know. Part of it is I think that, BDD wasn't well known. And so it probably didn't occur to her that, as it doesn't with many people with BDD, they don't think, oh, psychotherapy is my first best option. What they think and what my mom thought and what I thought and agreed to is that plastic surgery is one's first best option because, if one's nose, in my case, looks ugly, then you fix it with plastic surgery or rhinoplasty. And my mom agreed to it. And I got one. And this was, the summer before I went off to college, which is probably kind of the ideal time because no one from my high school, knew what I was doing. And then people from college didn't really know how I really, how I looked in childhood. So it was kind of that nice gap time that I could get it done. But I mean, if anyone has had it, any kind of plastic surgery, what they don't tell you and probably should, is that your face swells up. And I got 2 black eyes. My face just swelled up and I looked so ghastly afterwards that my mom had to put towels over all the mirrors in the house because I couldn't stand to look at myself. I was freaking myself out so badly. Because there's a lot of scar tissue at first before the swelling goes down. And it probably took about a year for the swelling to go completely down anyway. But the upshot of it was that my mom was happy. She seemed to feel that the rhinoplasty had been successful. My nose was thinner. She liked the way it looked. She thought it was a good shape. But I felt so much worse. I didn't like the way it looked. I thought it looked too much like a ski slope. I still thought it was a little too wide. It still didn't look, glamorous like the models in the magazines. And I felt worse afterwards because I felt so guilty that my mother had spent money on this procedure and I wanted another one. But I didn't have the money, thankfully. Now I look back and say thankfully. And I never told my mom because I was like, oh my God, she loves it. So why would I mention to her that I hate it? I mean, it would totally destroy her. But for me, it was interesting because before that, all I knew was I felt really depressed about my appearance because society tells us, told me, and I think in some ways still does. Of course, with me, it was the fashion magazines. I think, nowadays it's social media, Instagram and TikTok and all those things, tell, young women and men that they don't look good enough. Right. And so for me, I just always felt like, oh, of course I'm depressed because I'm ugly. And so society tells me that that's a totally good reason, valid reason to be depressed. The thing about the plastic surgery was it was the first glimmer of insight. And insight is kind of the knowledge that one has a mental health disorder and doesn't just believe everything that the mirror tells a person. Because I was delusional, meaning I believed that the mirror didn't lie to me. And I believed that I looked just like what I saw, which is not true for people with BDD. But I believed it until the plastic surgery. And then something told me, most people like my mother are pleased after they have plastic surgery. I mean, that's what I've heard. And yet I'm not. So maybe it's not just about my looks. Maybe there's something else going on. I still suffered throughout my 20s. I worked in an art gallery. I was really happy at the art gallery. But, doing what you love, the money doesn't always follow. I spoke to my dad and I was like, Dad, I really love what I'm doing, but I'm still asking you for money. And I feel like at 30, I probably shouldn't be. What do you think I should do? And he's like, well, you could ask for a raise, or you could just, find a different job. And I did. And I was turned down for a raise. And so I was like, well, my best friend's in Colorado, my friend Stephanie, and my brother moved to Colorado to go to CU Boulder Law School. And I was like, well, I could make a clean start. I could go to Colorado. And that's what I did. And so it was great being out here because I love the Rocky Mountains. I loved hiking. And really, for me, being inside made me feel so trapped because inevitably I tried to avoid the mirror, but I would inevitably end up in front of it for hours and hours and hours, which had happened a lot in Boston as well. And I just, once I was outside hiking in the woods, mostly by myself, sometimes with friends, but I just felt so much better because I could just be outside in nature. I love nature. And I didn't think about my nose because I couldn't see my nose. I couldn't see my face when I was outside hiking. So that was really such a joy for me when I moved out here. And then my friend Stephanie, she introduced me to ultra running because she started ultra running, which is any distance over a marathon. And that was really nice for a while. And that was also kind of, my mom had passed. She passed when I was 34. And so I just started getting treatment for BDD at that time, but I never told her about the BDD. And I also didn't tell her I was getting treatment. But really for me, like being outdoors running and being part of that whole group was really helpful in terms of like coping with those negative feelings and then also coping with the loss of my mom because she had also been very active when she was alive, but then she had breast cancer and it came back and came back and came back. So really ultra running and being outside in nature, and exercising and getting fresh air really helped, cope with that sadness and depression and with the symptoms. But fortunately, when I was in Colorado, this was before self-checkouts in grocery stores. And that's important because at that time you were forced to wait in line to check out your groceries. So I noticed this magazine cover, this Shape magazine, which kind of bills itself as a fitness magazine, but it's as much a fashion magazine as it is a fitness magazine. And I'm looking at this magazine cover and there's this gorgeous, blonde haired model, very shapely, this hourglass shape with, and just so fit though, and so beautiful. And beautiful blue eyes and beautiful blue bikini and long, smooth skin and long blonde hair. And I was just, because that was always my ideal. Like I always wanted to look like that. And I don't, by the way. I'm brunette with hazel eyes and, let's just say I don't have an hourglass shape. And then I looked around and there were different, titles of articles around her as there usually are. And one of the articles said, hate your looks, what to do when the mirror lies. And I was like, wow. Well, I do hate my looks when I'm comparing them to the model on the magazine. And B, I never had thought about the fact that the mirror was lying to me. I always thought that what I saw in the mirror was absolutely real and true. And so I was fascinated. So I picked up the magazine and I'm leafing through the article and there was some excerpts. They were talking about research that Sabine Wilhelm had done, and they took excerpts from Catherine Phillips' book, The Broken Mirror. And they had kind of a 5-questionnaire self-diagnosis test, and then they had excerpts from people with it. And I was like, wow, I think I answered yes to at least 3 out of the 5 questions. And I won't go into them all, but it's like, do you avoid mirrors? Are you fixated by mirrors? Are you, do you think about a body part for more than like 8 hours a day? And I constantly thought about my nose all the time. So I was like, wow, I think this is what I have.
In this third section, Eva talks about the different kinds of treatment she received for her BDD and how they've helped bring about a huge shift in what she values in herself, as well as helping her get to the root of why she felt so terrible about herself in the first place.
You should always go to a clinician and, therapist and make sure, that you're correct. But I would say so many people who self-diagnose really understand that they have this disorder because it's so easy to recognize the symptoms. And once you recognize the symptoms, you're like, wow, maybe I have a mental health disorder and it's called body dysmorphic disorder. And that's what I realized that day. I mean, I bought the magazine. I still have it. And then I decided, I think there was a gap. And I was trying to figure out why there was a gap because I know I still have my last bottle of Prozac. I was on Prozac for 2 years. But again, I was diagnosed with depression because when I self-diagnosed myself and went into therapy in 2000, not too many therapists, and unfortunately that's still the case, but I think less so now than it was back in 2000. Very few therapists knew about BDD, and it wasn't as prominently in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health Disorders, because now it's listed as an OCD spectrum disorder. But before, it was kind of hidden in as a somatoform disorder, and not too many therapists knew about it. So I was diagnosed with depression and put on Prozac. But what's interesting is I have my last bottle of Prozac and it says 2002. And I know I was on Prozac for 2 years and in therapy for 2 years for my symptoms. So I think the gap actually had to do with lack of insurance. And I know that I went to Kaiser Permanente, which is an HMO, and they had a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And I saw both of them during those 2 years. And so I know that I had to have had health insurance to obviously have Kaiser. So I'm sure, I waited and I think I coped until I had health insurance. And also I think, there was a lot of stigma involved with having a mental health condition. So I kind of had to get to the point of readiness where I had to say, okay, I've had for, this long, the stigma of feeling ugly. But now I have kind of the realization that I have a mental health disorder, but there's a stigma to that too. So which stigma is worse? And I decided, the stigma of having a mental health disorder was actually less for me than the stigma of feeling that I was ugly. So I went and I'm like, I'm going to go all in on this mental health disorder. And then once I had health insurance, I'm like, Catherine Phillips says that there are treatments available that can help. But like I said, I was diagnosed with depression. And fortunately, I was put on Prozac, which is a SSRI, which also has been shown to be effective in treating body dysmorphic disorder. So I was really fortunate in that way. And I actually had to ask her to put me on Prozac, not because I'm really for, big pharma meds, but my mom, after she got cancer, had been put on Prozac because, needless to say, when you get cancer, my mom was depressed about the fact that she wouldn't, live to see her grandchildren, which unfortunately did happen. She did pass before my brother had children. I never had children. And I think another reason I'm really mission driven and wanting more and more young people to recover and get the help they need to recover at an early age is because by the time I recovered, I was 36 and I wasn't in a serious relationship. And so for me, I didn't really get into a serious relationship until after I started my dissertation. And at that point, we weren't going to rush in and have children right away because we were still getting to know one another. And so it is now that I'm, past 50, it is a regret that I have that my BDD kept me from having children because of that initial fear of not wanting to pass on my ugly nose, even post plastic surgery, because of course, plastic surgery only alters the surface, doesn't really alter the underlying genetics, as I kept telling myself. So I really, and I'm surrounded in a neighborhood now, my partner and I'm still the same person 13 years later, we're still together, but, we're surrounded by little kids because we live near a school. And, that's the one regret I have because I know my mom loved being a mom. She was so happy that she had my brother and I, and it gave her such joy. And I think that's really my one regret, that I didn't I didn't self-diagnose and recover sooner when I could have, in my early 30s, still had the possibility of having my own children, because now I don't have that fear of passing on my ugly nose to my children because I realize there's so much more to us than, our facial features. And I think that's the biggest thing, as I say, and I'll wrap up kind of my recovery story that's online, is the feeling that, I'm not my nose. Post-recovery, I will say I don't regret having the plastic surgery anymore because so much of BDD is looking back with a regret. And so many people after they have plastic surgery are like, oh, I don't like it. Oh, I want another one, just like what I said. But that's the BDD trap, is always looking back into the past and always thinking, oh, I looked so much better when I was this age, or I looked so much better before the plastic surgery, or if I only have another plastic surgery, I'll be able to look the way I want to look. And it's just a lie that BDD tells us. One thing, and I'm not sure where I read this, but I know, I believe Sabine Wilhelm in her book, Feeling Good About the Way You Look, which I also recommend, she does have charts that kind of talk about one's identity and kind of, thinking about how much is your self-worth tied up into your appearance. And for me, when I had BDD, I would say 90%. Versus only 10%, which was, hey, I'm a good person. I have pets I love. I'm a good runner. I'm a good friend. All the other things that are important in life. I'm a good college instructor. But that didn't count for much. It was all about my nose. And if I didn't like my nose, I was worthless. That's really what I felt like. But post BDD and post recovery, it's like 90% is who I am as a person, what I'm accomplishing in my life. I wouldn't say, and I told a clinician this, it's not like I recovered and my self-esteem was through the roof. I mean, it took my self-esteem, and I still wouldn't say I'm a person with like overly high self-esteem. I'm fairly modest. I don't make a great deal about my accomplishments because, I don't have like the highest self-esteem of people in the world. But I will say that now 90% of how I feel about myself is based on my accomplishments, what I do every day, being a loving, walking my cat, having my partner in my life, having good friends. That's what's most important to me. And then 10%, yeah, sure, aging, isn't always great, but I will say, and I do reassure people, I will never get plastic surgery or a facelift. My mom got a facelift. It worked great for her because she didn't have BDD, so she liked it. But, this came up in a recent support group that I ran. And I, because I can mention what I said, which is I will never have a facelift. There are multiple reasons why I will never have a facelift. First of all, because I'm so particular and I'm still a perfectionist. I'm still artistic. If it wasn't done just the way I wanted, I would so regret it. I know that, first of all. I mean, I just know that. That goes without saying. BDD, I'm worried that my BDD symptoms might get triggered from having, because I don't think what people realize is when you have plastic surgery, any type of plastic surgery, it's very invasive. It's major surgery and you're recovering for a long time and there's scars, there's scarring. It's not something to take lightly. And for me, I've seen older women in their 80s. I've seen them with facelifts. I've seen them without facelifts. And I'll tell you, going natural looks a lot better in 180s than having this, really weird, pulled up, windswept look. And I know that. And so for me, being alive, being healthy, being able to accomplish my goals, that's so much more important to me than having a few wrinkles and to not be so focused on my looks and to say, yeah, sure, I would like it if I still, had the same, skin tone as I did when I was 30, but I'm not 30 and I'm alive. And, my mom passed at 69. If I can go past 69 and be alive and healthy, that's a great accomplishment. That's something that I'm going to be so happy about. And yeah, so I'll look older. It's what happens when one gets older, one looks older, and there's nothing really wrong with that. We're told there's something wrong with that in our society, but there really isn't. But again, how it happened was both getting past the BDD symptoms, in those 2 years using medication and therapy, but then also, between the time that I was 36 and the time I was 40, I still worked with a different person who was more of a holistic counselor who really helped me, do a lot of introspection, a lot of analyzing my dreams, taught me about meditation, which is great as a coping technique, but also helped me to get off of Prozac. A lot of different techniques to really start getting at these core issues. And there was a lot of childhood trauma when I was growing up. And I won't go into it in great depth, but I do go into it a little bit in the first chapter of my book. And there is a blog on the International OCD Foundation website called Family Trauma and Body Dysmorphic Disorder, where I talk about this in more detail. But my parents fought a lot. And my father had quite a temper. He got angry a lot. And I had a temper too, but I would get upset. I would vent and cry, have temper tantrums, as they're called. And my mom, I really feel like I said, my mom was my best friend and she loved my brother and I, but she could be very critical. And, she was also probably perfectionist, perfectionistic tendencies, and she was an artist. But she also, she found it very difficult, needless to say, living with my father with the emotional outbursts. And so when I had the emotional outbursts, one of the things she said, probably meaning well, but it didn't come across well for me, was stop acting like your father. And because my parents really didn't love each other very much, they displayed a lot of criticism and even contempt for one another during the marriage. I internalized that. Now, I know that now. I didn't know that when I was a child, and I certainly didn't know that before I started getting the BDD symptoms. This was something I was able to come to after doing more work through this other, counselor person and doing more therapy, was really to realize that I internalized that message from my mother as saying, well, your father has these issues. Well, she did kind of tell me, don't be like your father because you're going to make people unhappy. You won't be in a loving relationship if you keep venting at people. And though I understand that's certainly true, I mean, no one wants to be around someone who's constantly yelling. The other message that I kind of internalized that I don't think she intended for me to internalize, I'm pretty sure she didn't, was the fact that I know she really didn't like my father very much. I mean, one could use that word hate in some ways. And so when she said, stop acting like your father, I kind of internalized that to say, well, maybe there's that part of me she hates too. But, it's really hard as a child to think your mother hates you. So I think what I started doing when I was 16, knowing that my appearance didn't really please my mother. I mean, I wasn't the ideal either. I think we both were looking at that blonde hair, blue-eyed ideal. And she was more towards that ideal. She wasn't blonde hair, but she, had come from, her relatives had come over from the Mayflower. So she was much more that English, right? That English look with the pale skin, the pale hair, and the very fair skin. And that's, and my father was from Austria. So I had more the Germanic kind of look. And so I think, given that society places parameters on what one should look like, and I know that there was some ways that my looks were not meeting my mother's expectations, that I think I just put the two together. I mean, this is what I think I did subconsciously. I did not consciously do this, but I think subconsciously, what I did was go, well, there's something about me that my mom doesn't like. And I didn't trace it all the way back to my childhood at that point. I was just like, well, I'm starting to, not like the way I look. I'm starting to look in the mirror and I know that I'm not pleased with the way I look, right? According to the fashion magazines, there's something wrong with me. So I think it was just easier for the symptoms of BDD to come up because it's so much easier to just blame one's looks than to really do the deep work at 16 when you're a teenager anyway and going through all those struggles that teenagers do to go, well, maybe this happened early in my childhood, right? No, I mean, of course we don't do that. So, I think for some people, not for everyone, because some people didn't have a traumatic upbringing. Some people had parents who loved each other and had a very, normal upbringing, and they also get BDD. But I know for a lot of people that have been in my group, and even for the group that I studied for my dissertation, there is some history of family trauma. But I mean, for me, getting at that family trauma or getting at that childhood trauma was really how at 40 years old, I could really feel and I can say that I'm recovered from BDD. It wasn't only getting rid of the symptoms of BDD, it was going and finding out the cause of why I felt so terrible about myself, why I felt like, why I felt so rejected and why I had this deep kind of self-hatred. Because I felt like I was genetically flawed. Somehow I interpreted what my mom said to me as like, well, you're fatally genetically flawed like your father. And once I went through this counseling, I was able to realize that that's not true. I don't have my father's flaws. I have my own flaws. But if I have my own flaws, I can fix my flaws. And I have. And I've worked on fixing my flaws. But there's a sense of control. There's a sense of, I can take control. I can choose not to vent when I get upset.
In the final section, Eva shares the things that have helped her most in her recovery, along with suggestions for sufferers, including finding a therapist you really trust and feel comfortable with.
I can tell you what's helped a lot in terms of my working on my communication skills is basically teaching interpersonal communication. I also enjoy public speaking now and giving talks and teaching public speaking. Well, actually working in the art gallery and selling artwork actually helped with that. But also teaching public speaking skills actually helps with that too. So certainly teaching communication, learning more about conflict communication, which I've also taught, has really helped me acquire skills and recognize my patterns that have developed through my past. A lot of it has to do with communication, not only external communication with other people, but of course the internal messages that we tell ourselves, and just being very careful about not feeding a lot of negative messages to oneself. For me, and again, growing up when I did, there was a lot of self-help books around, and I was definitely a big self-help person. So I read Dr. Wayne Dyer's Your Erroneous Zones, and I'm actually rereading it right now. That's why I'm thinking about it. And again, it's a lot of how does one take control of one's emotions and one's thoughts and one's behavior. But I will say that that is really almost impossible to do for people with a mental health disorder like BDD. And that's why I would definitely urge people to try to get treatment first. However, all of these things like meditation and, not beating up on oneself and getting outdoors and exercising and hanging out with friends, not becoming a recluse, trying to put oneself out there, being brave, being courageous, expressing what you're feeling to people. Don't be afraid to join a support group and share your feelings and share what you're going through in terms of your suffering, because all of these things are really important coping skills that will help both when you're perhaps waiting to see a therapist, because I know waiting lists can be a problem in the UK. But, even after you've seen a therapist and after you've recovered, to really keep yourself recovered. So, these coping skills can be used both before therapy, during therapy, but then even after, getting done with therapy. So that's what I would recommend for everyone is, try to find a support group. But, you're certainly welcome to read books about BDD and about how to cope with it and different techniques, as long as, understanding that sometimes, especially when one is delusional like I was, thinking about how you can help yourself can also just sometimes end up thinking about that feature that you hate, and sometimes can exacerbate symptoms if you don't have someone there helping you and reminding you, hey, don't do that. Because for me, I needed a lot of help. I started when I was 2000 and then probably ended sometime about 7 years later, all things considered. So it wasn't an overnight process, although getting over the symptoms took me about 2 years with the medication and stuff. But then, getting deeper into it probably took another 3 or 4 of really, getting at those feelings. And people ask me, were you able to reconcile or let your parents know? Well, my parents both passed when I was 34 from different things. And I never told my parents about my body dysmorphic disorder. So what really helped was just going through the therapy process, understanding the trauma that they had both experienced with their mothers growing up, because they both had trauma with their mothers, and then just forgiving them because, everyone has issues growing up and our parents are not perfect. And once I forgave them because of knowing how they grew up, then I was able to forgive myself and that's so important in BDD, is being able to not beat up on oneself, but to forgive oneself and be compassionate with oneself. And that's also how I end my support groups is, please be kind and compassionate with yourself, along your road to recovery from BDD. That's probably the single most important thing, is to just practice self-care and self-compassion. The one thing I remember about the therapy, and the one thing I do want to impress upon people, is that, I use talk therapy, and I do know that CBT is considered the gold standard for BDD treatment. However, I do tell people in my support groups, and I really feel this is true, that having a really trusting relationship with a therapist that you like whether or not they're necessarily specialized in BDD is probably the most important thing. Because if that person really cares, then there are resources available on the BDD Foundation website, for example, and on the International OCD Foundation website for therapists to learn more about BDD. There are a lot of books out there by therapists and clinicians and researchers about how to treat BDD symptoms. So if the clinician or therapist is someone that you like and trust, and they're willing to read and educate themselves, I mean, it's certainly helpful if somebody knows about exposure response prevention, ERP, or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But again, I used medication and talk therapy, and that's what worked for me. So I think it's important not to just say, well, my therapy isn't helping me because the person doesn't know about BDD. Well, if the person doesn't know about BDD and you like the person and you trust the person, then maybe don't be afraid to mention BDD symptoms to them, or bring in a book like The Broken Mirror, or bring in the letter that the BDD Foundation offers for people to bring into their, therapist or GP. If you have that trusting relationship with a healthcare provider, take advantage of that, because that's important. It's important to have as many people in your corner fighting for you. And that can be, like I said, people in a support group. It can be therapists, it can be family members, it can be a trusted friend, but really having people around you that you trust, that you feel can understand what you're going through and that you can confide in is so important. Don't try to go it alone. That would be my biggest piece of advice.
Thanks again to Eva for sharing her story, which I'm sure will give hope to many. You can read more about her experiences on both the BDD Foundation website and the International OCD Foundation website. To hear more episodes, just search for Beating BDD wherever you get your podcasts. You can also leave us feedback by following the BDD Foundation on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. I'll be back with another interview as soon as I can. Until then, a reminder that this podcast isn't therapy, so please do seek help from a trained professional. Thanks for listening.